There's a screen in front of you. If you expand it now, full screen, and allow yourself to settle in, you may find the next few hours more immersive than you expect. This is not entertainment designed to hold attention through spectacle. It is a sustained examination of a problem humanity has been quietly assembling the pieces to solve for more than half a century. If that kind of experience appeals to you, consider subscribing. New long-form content appears here regularly. Now, let the world around you fall away. We're going to talk about Mars. Not the Mars of science fiction. Not the Mars of distant aspiration. The Mars that exists as a physical destination, a specific coordinate in space, orbiting the sun at a distance that shifts and swings according to the laws of celestial mechanics. The Mars we can see on certain nights, glowing faintly red against the black. The Mars that is not a dream, but a logistics problem. A monumental, interconnected, unforgiving logistics problem that demands solutions to questions most people never think to ask. How do you move a human body across a gulf of space so vast that light itself takes minutes to cross it? How do you keep that body alive, functional, and sane while it travels through an environment that is hostile in ways both obvious and insidious? How do you land on a world with almost no atmosphere, build shelter where none exists, generate power where the sun is weaker, produce food where nothing grows, and then, after all of that, how do you come home? These are not abstract questions. They are engineering constraints, biological limits, psychological thresholds, and every single one of them must be answered not with optimism or willpower, but with hardware, energy, mass, time, and precision. Going to Mars is not about courage. It is about thermodynamics. It is about orbital mechanics. It is about the carrying capacity of a spacecraft, the degradation rate of human muscle in zero gravity, the energy density of rocket fuel, and the latency of a radio signal traveling across interplanetary space. It is about the fact that Mars is not a place you can simply go to. It is a place you must calculate your way toward, one variable at a time, and the number of variables is staggering. Start with distance. Mars orbits the Sun at an average distance of about 142 million miles from Earth. But that number is misleading because it suggests a fixed separation. In reality, the distance between Earth and Mars is never constant. Both planets move. Earth completes an orbit every 365 days. Mars takes 687 days. They do not circle the Sun in perfect synchrony. Sometimes they're on the same side of the solar system, relatively close. Sometimes they're on opposite sides, separated by the full width of the Sun's gravitational sphere. At the nearest approach, called opposition, Mars can be as close as 34 million miles. At the farthest, when the two planets are in what is called superior conjunction, the gap swells to nearly 250 million miles. This is not a minor variation. It is the difference between a feasible mission and an impossible one. Because of this orbital geometry, launch windows to Mars open only at specific intervals. Roughly every 26 months, Earth and Mars align in a way that makes a transfer trajectory efficient. Miss that window, and you wait more than 2 years for the next one. And even when the window is open, the journey is not a straight line. Spacecraft do not fly directly toward Mars. They follow an elliptical path known as a Hohmann transfer orbit, a trajectory that balances energy efficiency with travel time. Fire the engines too early and you waste fuel. Fire them too late and you miss the planet entirely. The margin for error is measured in meters per second, and the consequences of miscalculation are absolute. Space does not forgive imprecision. The Hohmann transfer orbit is the baseline trajectory, the most fuel-efficient path between two orbits in the same plane. It requires 2 burns. The first accelerates the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and onto an elliptical path that intersects Mars' orbit. The second burn, executed upon arrival, slows the spacecraft down enough to be captured by Mars' gravity. In theory, this is elegant. In practice, it imposes a travel time of approximately 180 to 210 days, depending on the specific alignment of the planets. That is 6 to 7 months in transit, one way. And because Mars and Earth continue to move, the return journey cannot begin immediately. The crew must wait on Mars for the planets to realign, which takes roughly 450 to 500 days. Add the 2 transit legs, and the surface stay together. And a complete mission to Mars lasts around 900 days. 2.5 years. That is the clock. That is the commitment. Every system, every component, every human body must function reliably for that entire span. There is no resupply, no rescue mission, no margin for catastrophic failure. Now, consider what it takes to move a spacecraft along that trajectory. Velocity. Enormous, specific amounts of velocity. To escape Earth's gravity well and enter a transfer orbit, a spacecraft must reach a velocity of roughly 11.2 kilometers per second relative to Earth. That is escape velocity. But escaping Earth is only the first step. The spacecraft must also carry enough velocity to decelerate at Mars, adjust its trajectory mid-flight, and potentially execute an emergency burn if something goes wrong. All of that requires propellant. And propellant has mass. And mass requires more propellant to move. This is the tyranny of the rocket equation, and it governs everything. The Tsiolkovsky rocket equation describes the relationship between the velocity a rocket can achieve, the mass of the propellant, and the efficiency of the engine. It is a logarithmic equation, which means that increasing your final velocity requires exponentially more fuel. To reach Mars, a spacecraft might need a delta V, a change in velocity, of around 6 kilometers per second from low Earth orbit. To achieve that with chemical rockets, the mass ratio between the fueled and empty spacecraft can be 10 to 1 or higher. In other words, for every kilogram of payload, spacecraft structure, life support, and cargo, you need 10 kilograms of propellant. And that is just for the outbound leg. If you want to come back, you need even more. The numbers spiral quickly. A crewed Mars mission using traditional chemical propulsion would require launching hundreds of tons into Earth orbit, far beyond the capacity of any single rocket. This is why orbital refueling becomes necessary. This is why the architecture grows complex. Orbital refueling is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite. The concept is straightforward. Instead of launching a fully fueled spacecraft from Earth, you launch the spacecraft and the fuel separately, then transfer the fuel in orbit. This allows you to bypass the rocket equation's harshest penalties because each launch only needs to lift a fraction of the total mass. A tanker carries fuel to low Earth orbit. The crew vehicle docks with the tanker. Propellant is transferred. The process repeats until the spacecraft is fully fueled. Only then does the journey to Mars begin. But this introduces new problems. Cryogenic propellants like liquid methane and liquid oxygen must be kept at extremely low temperatures, well below -100 degrees Celsius. In the vacuum of space, maintaining those temperatures over days or weeks requires active cooling, insulation, and careful thermal management. Boil-off is inevitable. Some fuel will evaporate. The question is how much and whether the loss is acceptable. Then there is the matter of the spacecraft itself. Not just its engines or fuel tanks, but its structure, its systems, its ability to sustain human life for months on end. A crewed Mars vehicle is not a capsule. It is a small, self-contained habitat, a mobile ecosystem that must provide breathable air, drinkable water, stable temperature, radiation shielding, food, waste processing, power, and psychological space for a crew of perhaps 4 to 6 people. Every one of these functions requires hardware. That hardware has mass. That mass must be launched. And once in space, that hardware must work continuously, without failure, for the duration of the mission. Redundancy is not optional. Critical systems must be duplicated, sometimes triplicate, because a single failure in life support, power generation, or propulsion could end the mission or the crew. Power is fundamental. Without it, nothing else functions. Solar panels are the lightest option, but Mars receives only about 44% of the sunlight that Earth does, and during the transit, the spacecraft is moving through interplanetary space where the sun's intensity diminishes with distance. Solar arrays must be large, and they degrade over time due to radiation and micrometeorite impacts. The alternative is nuclear power. Radioisotope thermoelectric generators convert heat from radioactive decay into electricity. They are reliable, long-lasting, and unaffected by the position of the sun. But they are heavy, expensive, and politically sensitive. Launching a nuclear reactor into space requires regulatory approval, public acceptance, and engineering safeguards to ensure that if a launch fails, the reactor does not scatter radioactive material across the Earth's surface. Despite these challenges, nuclear power is almost certainly necessary for a crewed Mars mission because the energy demands are constant and unforgiving. Life support systems must recycle nearly everything. Water cannot be resupplied. Air cannot be vented and replaced. Every breath the crew exhales must be scrubbed of carbon dioxide and replenished with oxygen. Every drop of urine, every bead of sweat must be filtered, purified, and returned to the water supply. This is not a metaphor. On the International Space Station, astronauts drink recycled urine. The system is so efficient that the water recovered is cleaner than most municipal tap water on Earth. But the ISS is in low Earth orbit, a few hundred kilometers away. Resupply missions arrive every few months. On the way to Mars, there is no resupply. The life support system must function with near-perfect reliability for years, and it must do so within a closed loop where any contamination, any mechanical failure, any biological imbalance can cascade into catastrophe. Oxygen can be generated through electrolysis, splitting water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is breathed. The hydrogen can be vented or used in other chemical processes. Carbon dioxide, exhaled by the crew, must be scrubbed from the air. The ISS uses a system called the Carbon Dioxide Removal Assembly, which chemically binds CO2 and then vents it overboard. But venting is wasteful. A better approach is to react the CO2 with hydrogen in a process called Sabatier reaction, producing methane and water. The water is electrolyzed again. The cycle continues. This is called a closed-loop life support system. And while the concept is proven, operating it flawlessly for 900 days in deep space is not. Food is another closed loop, though a more difficult one. Carrying 900 days of food for a crew of 6 means carrying roughly 10,000 kilograms of provisions, and that assumes freeze-dried, vacuum-sealed, calorie-dense rations with minimal packaging. That is 10 tons. 10 tons that could otherwise be used for fuel, equipment, or shielding. The alternative is to grow food in transit, but growing food in microgravity is a challenge that has only been partially solved. Plant and grow in space. Lettuce, radishes, peppers, and wheat have all been cultivated aboard the ISS. But growing enough calories to sustain a crew requires space, light, water, nutrients, and CO2, all of which must be provided and managed. The system must be efficient enough that the energy and resources used to grow the food do not exceed the energy and resources saved by not carrying it. The math is tight, and the margin for agricultural failure is non-existent. A failed crop is not an inconvenience. It is a potential death sentence. Then there is radiation. Space is flooded with it. Outside the protective bubble of Earth's magnetosphere, charged particles from the sun and high-energy cosmic rays from distant supernovae stream through the void, unimpeded. A single solar flare can release a burst of protons intense enough to deliver a lethal dose of radiation in hours. Cosmic rays are slower but relentless, a constant background drizzle of particles moving at nearly the speed of light. They pass through the hull of a spacecraft. They pass through water. They pass through human tissue, shattering DNA, damaging cells, increasing the risk of cancer, cataracts, and central nervous system degradation. On Earth, we are shielded by the atmosphere and the magnetosphere. In space, there is no shield. The crew is exposed. Radiation exposure is measured in sieverts. A typical person on Earth receives about 2 to 3 millisieverts per year from natural background sources. A chest X-ray delivers about 0.1 millisieverts. Astronauts on the ISS receive roughly 150 millisieverts per year, a significant increase, but still within acceptable limits for short missions. On a Mars mission, The crew will be exposed to approximately 300 millisieverts during the 6-month transit and another 300 on the return. That is 600 millisieverts over the course of the mission, not including time spent on the Martian surface, where the atmosphere provides minimal protection. This is enough to increase lifetime cancer risk by several percentage points. It is below the threshold for acute radiation sickness, but it is not safe. And those numbers assume average solar activity. If a large solar particle event occurs during the mission, the dose could be much higher. Shielding is the obvious solution, but shielding is mass, and mass is expensive. Water is an excellent radiation shield. Hydrogen-rich materials absorb particles effectively. If the crew's water supply, food stores, and waste tanks are positioned around the sleeping quarters, they provide passive shielding. But this is only partial. To truly protect the crew, you would need meters of water or polyethylene surrounding the habitat, and that adds tons of mass. Some designs propose a radiation storm shelter, a small, heavily shielded compartment where the crew can retreat during solar events. This reduces the mass penalty because only a small volume is protected, but it requires early warning. The sun must be monitored constantly, and when a flare erupts, the crew has perhaps 30 minutes to an hour to take shelter before the particles arrive. Miss the warning, and the shelter is useless. Microgravity is another silent threat, less dramatic than radiation, but no less serious. The human body evolved under Earth's gravity. Bones, muscles, cardiovascular system, inner ear, all calibrated to a constant 1G downward pull. Remove that pull, and the body begins to adapt, but the adaptations are not beneficial. Bones lose density at a rate of about 1 to 2% per month because there is no mechanical stress to maintain them. Muscles atrophy because they are not working against resistance. The heart becomes less efficient because it does not need to pump blood upward against gravity. Fluid shifts from the lower body to the upper body, causing facial puffiness, nasal congestion, and increased intracranial pressure. The vestibular system, which controls balance, becomes confused because there is no up or down. Many astronauts experience space motion sickness for the first few days in orbit, a disorienting nausea that gradually fades as the brain recalibrates. But the deeper changes, the bone loss, the muscle atrophy, the cardiovascular deconditioning, these do not fade. They accumulate. Exercise is the primary countermeasure. Astronauts on the ISS exercise for 2 hours every day, using treadmills, stationary bikes, and resistance machines to simulate the mechanical stress of gravity. Even with rigorous exercise, bone density declines, though the rate is slowed. After 6 months on the ISS, astronauts lose roughly 10% of their bone mass in weight-bearing bones like the hips and spine. On a 900-day Mars mission, the losses could be even greater, and there's a threshold beyond which bones do not fully recover. Return to Earth after years in space, and the skeleton may be permanently weakened. Fractures become more likely. Osteoporosis sets in prematurely. This is not speculation. It is physiology. Artificial gravity could solve the problem, but artificial gravity requires rotation. A spacecraft spun around its axis generates centrifugal force, which mimics the feel of gravity. The crew experiences a downward pull. Bones and muscles are stressed, fluids settle, and the body remains healthy. But building a rotating spacecraft is not trivial. The rotation rate must be carefully chosen. Too fast, and the Coriolis effect becomes disorienting. Too slow, and the centrifugal force is insufficient. The radius of rotation also matters. A small radius means a steep gradient in artificial gravity between your head and your feet, which can cause nausea and disorientation. A large radius requires a large structure, which means more mass, more complexity, and more cost. Most current Mars mission architectures do not include artificial gravity because the engineering trade-offs are unfavorable. The crew will travel in microgravity and accept the physical consequences. Psychological endurance is harder to quantify, but no less critical. 6 people, confined to a small pressurized module, isolated from Earth, unable to see their families, unable to step outside, unable to escape each other's company. Communication with Earth is delayed by the speed of light. At the closest approach, a radio signal takes about 3 minutes to travel from Mars to Earth. At the farthest, it takes more than 20 minutes. This means that a conversation is impossible. You cannot have a real-time discussion with mission control. You send a message. You wait. They respond. You wait again. The delay introduces a psychological distance that compounds the physical one. You're not just far from home. You are temporally disconnected, living in a bubble of delayed time where every decision must be made without immediate guidance. Isolation studies on Earth provide some insight. Research stations in Antarctica house small crews through the winter months, cut off from resupply and communication. Submarine crews endure long deployments in confined spaces. The psychological patterns are consistent. Initial excitement gives way to routine. Routine gives way to boredom. Boredom gives way to irritability. Small annoyances become major conflicts. Sleep patterns deteriorate. Cognitive performance declines. Depression and anxiety increase. Some individuals adapt well. Others do not. On Earth, these missions can be aborted. Crew members can be evacuated. On the way to Mars, there is no evacuation. The crew must endure, and the selection process must identify individuals who can. Crew selection is not just about technical skills. It is about temperament, resilience, interpersonal compatibility, and the ability to remain productive under stress. Psychological screening for Mars astronauts will be more rigorous than anything currently practiced. Candidates will be tested in isolation, in simulated mission environments, under sleep deprivation, under interpersonal conflict scenarios. The goal is not to find people who never break. It is to find people who break in predictable, manageable ways, and who can recover without compromising the mission. This is a brutal standard, and it will exclude many otherwise qualified individuals. But the alternative is a crew that fractures halfway to Mars, and a fractured crew in deep space is a failed mission. The spacecraft must also support psychological health through environmental design. Windows are important. The ability to see Earth, to watch it shrink into a pale blue dot, and later to see Mars grow from a point of light into a visible world, provides a sense of progression and connection. Interior lighting must mimic the natural day-night cycle to regulate circadian rhythms. Private sleeping quarters, even if they are small, give crew members a place to retreat. Communication bandwidth with Earth must be sufficient for video calls with family, for entertainment, for news. These are not luxuries. They are operational necessities because a mentally healthy crew performs better, makes fewer mistakes, and is less likely to experience mission-threatening breakdowns. Now, the spacecraft approaches Mars. 6 months have passed. The crew has survived the transit, managed the radiation, maintained their health through exercise and discipline, and kept the spacecraft operational despite equipment failures and minor emergencies. Ahead, Mars grows larger, its ruddy surface resolving into recognizable features. Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system, rises above the horizon. Valles Marineris, a canyon system that dwarfs the Grand Canyon, stretches across the landscape. The spacecraft is still traveling at interplanetary velocity, several kilometers per second relative to Mars. To be captured by the planet's gravity and enter orbit, the engines must fire again. This is the Mars orbit insertion burn, and it is critical. Too much thrust. And the spacecraft schemes the atmosphere and flies past Mars into a heliocentric orbit from which recovery is difficult or impossible. Too little thrust, and the orbit is too high, requiring additional fuel to descend. The burn must be precise, and it must be executed autonomously because the communication delay means mission control cannot intervene in real time. Mars orbit is not the destination. The crew has come to land on the surface, and landing on Mars is one of the most technically demanding maneuvers in spaceflight. Mars has an atmosphere, but it is almost negligible, less than 1% the density of Earth's atmosphere. It is thick enough to generate heat during entry, requiring a heat shield, but too thin to provide effective aerodynamic braking. A parachute that works on Earth barely slows a spacecraft on Mars. Traditional entry, descent, and landing techniques, the kind used by Apollo on the Moon or the Space Shuttle on Earth, do not translate directly. Mars is a middle ground, too much atmosphere to ignore, too little to rely on. And the result is a landing problem that has destroyed more missions than any other phase of Martian exploration. Entry begins at an altitude of roughly 125 kilometers, where the thin Martian atmosphere first starts to interact with the spacecraft. The vehicle is traveling at about 6 kilometers per second. Friction with the atmosphere generates heat, raising the temperature of the heat shield to over 1,600 degrees Celsius. The heat shield must absorb and radiate this energy without failing, because if it cracks or burns through, the spacecraft behind it is incinerated. The entry vehicle plunges deeper, decelerating rapidly. At around 10 kilometers altitude, the velocity has dropped to subsonic speeds, but the spacecraft is still falling too fast to land safely. A parachute deploys, slowing the descent further, but even the largest parachute cannot arrest the fall completely. Additional deceleration is required, and that means propulsion. Supersonic retropropulsion is the technique currently used by Mars landers. Rocket engines fire downward while the spacecraft is still traveling faster than the speed of sound, pushing against the thin atmosphere and the planet's gravity. This is counterintuitive because firing rockets into supersonic airflow creates turbulence, shock waves, and aerodynamic instability. Engineers once believed it was impossible. Early simulations showed that the exhaust plume would interact chaotically with the incoming air, causing the spacecraft to tumble. But testing proved otherwise. The technique works, though it requires precise control and significant thrust. The engines fire continuously, decelerating the vehicle to a hover and then lower it gently to the surface. This is how the Mars Science Laboratory, carrying the Curiosity rover, landed in 2012. It is how the Perseverance rover landed in 2021. But those were robotic missions, landing payloads of about 1 ton. A crewed mission requires landing tens of tons, possibly hundreds, and scaling up supersonic retropropulsion to that degree introduces uncertainties that have not yet been fully resolved. The landing site must be chosen carefully. Mars is a large planet, about half the diameter of Earth, with a surface area roughly equal to all the land area on Earth. Much of that surface is hostile. The polar regions are frozen. The equatorial deserts are covered in dust and rocks. The low-lying basins are easier to land in because the atmosphere is slightly denser at lower elevations, providing more deceleration. But those basins may not be scientifically interesting or strategically useful. The ideal landing site is low elevation, near the equator for maximum solar energy, free of large boulders and steep slopes, and close to resources like water ice. Identifying such a site requires high-resolution orbital imagery, radar mapping, and mineralogical analysis. Even then, the actual landing target is an ellipse of uncertainty several kilometers across because atmospheric turbulence and navigation errors prevent pinpoint accuracy. The spacecraft must be robust enough to handle whatever terrain it encounters within that ellipse. Once on the surface, the mission enters a new phase. The crew is no longer traveling. They are stationary, embedded in the Martian environment, subject to its conditions and constraints. Mars is not a hospitable place. The atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide, with traces of nitrogen and argon. There is no free oxygen. The atmospheric pressure at the surface is less than 1% of Earth's, equivalent to the pressure at an altitude of 35 kilometers above Earth. A human exposed to that pressure without a spacesuit would lose consciousness within 15 seconds and die within 2 minutes. Water in your tissues would vaporize. Your lungs would rupture if you try to hold your breath. The environment is immediately lethal, and it remains so for the entire duration of the surface stay. Temperature is another challenge. Mars is farther from the sun than Earth, and its thin atmosphere provides little insulation. Surface temperatures average around -60 degrees Celsius, though they can vary widely depending on location and time of day. Near the equator, daytime temperatures can rise above freezing, while nighttime temperatures plunge to negative 100 degrees Celsius or lower. The temperature swings are extreme, and any surface habitat must be insulated and heated to maintain a livable interior environment. Heat is generated by human bodies, by electronic equipment, and by active heating systems. But heat is also lost through conduction, radiation, and convection. In the thin Martian atmosphere, convection is minimal, but radiation is significant. Every surface exposed to the cold sky leaks heat, and maintaining warmth requires continuous energy input. The habitat is the crew's lifeline. It must provide pressure, oxygen, water, food, sanitation, and protection from radiation, temperature extremes, and dust. It must be large enough to accommodate the crew for 450 days or more, with enough space to move, work, exercise, and maintain psychological health. It must be airtight because a single leak, even a small one, could depressurize the entire structure. And it must be reliable because there is no backup habitat. If the primary structure fails, the crew has no shelter. They die. This is not a scenario anyone wants to contemplate, but it is a scenario that must be planned for, which means redundancy, spare parts, repair tools, and cross-training so that every crew member can address emergencies in any system. Building a habitat is itself a challenge. It could be pre-deployed, landed robotically before the crew arrives, and tested remotely to ensure everything works. This is the safest approach because if the habitat fails, the crew mission is delayed, not doomed. But a pre-deployed habitat must survive months or years on the surface, exposed to dust storms, temperature cycles, and cosmic radiation, before the crew even launches from Earth. It must be self-sufficient, capable of starting up autonomously, and resilient to faults. Alternatively, the habitat could arrive with the crew, which reduces the time it spends exposed on the surface, but introduces the risk that construction or setup fails after the crew is already committed to the mission. There is no perfect answer. Both approaches have been debated extensively, and the final decision will depend on the mission architecture, the available technology, and the acceptable level of risk. The habitat's interior environment must be carefully managed. The atmospheric composition is a trade-off between simplicity and safety. A pure oxygen atmosphere at low pressure, similar to the Apollo missions, reduces the structural mass of the habitat because lower pressure means thinner walls. But pure oxygen is a fire hazard, as the Apollo 1 crew tragically demonstrated. A mixed atmosphere, with nitrogen and oxygen similar to Earth's air, is safer but requires higher pressure and therefore thicker, heavier walls. Most current designs favor a mixed atmosphere at slightly reduced pressure, around 8 to 10 psi compared to Earth's 14.7 psi. This compromises between safety and mass efficiency, though it means the crew must pre-breathe pure oxygen for a period before exiting the habitat in spacesuits to avoid decompression sickness, just as scuba divers must avoid ascending too quickly. Water is essential, and it is scarce. Mars does have water, but it is locked in ice at the poles and buried in subsurface deposits. Extracting that ice, melting it, and purifying it requires energy and equipment. The process is not simple. Ice on Mars is often mixed with soil, forming a cement-like regolith that must be excavated, heated, and separated. The deeper you dig, the more effort it takes. Once extracted, the water must be filtered to remove perchlorates, toxic salts that are common in Martian soil. Perchlorates are highly reactive and harmful to human health, capable of disrupting thyroid function even at low concentrations. Removing them requires chemical treatment or thermal processing, both of which consume resources. In situ resource utilization, ISRU, is the concept of using Martian materials to produce what the crew needs rather than bringing everything from Earth. Water is one target. Oxygen is another. The Martian atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide, and CO2 can be split into oxygen and carbon monoxide through a process called solid oxide electrolysis. The oxygen is breathed or used in fuel production. The carbon monoxide can be vented or reacted further. This process requires electricity, which means it depends on having reliable power generation on the surface. Another ISRU process is the Sabatier reaction, which combines CO2 from the atmosphere with hydrogen brought from Earth to produce methane and water. The methane can be used as rocket fuel for the return journey, dramatically reducing the amount of propellant that must be launched from Earth. The water can be electrolyzed back into oxygen and hydrogen, closing the loop. This is not theoretical. A small-scale demonstration called MOXIE, the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment, flew on the Perseverance rover and successfully produced oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. The device is roughly the size of a car battery and produces about 10 grams of oxygen per hour, enough for a few minutes of breathing. Scaling this up to support a crew and produce tons of oxygen or methane for fuel requires a much larger system, more power, and continuous operation over months. But it is proven technology, and it is central to making Mars missions feasible because it reduces the mass that must be launched from Earth. Power generation on Mars can come from solar panels or nuclear reactors. Solar power is lighter and simpler, but Mars receives less sunlight than Earth, and dust storms can block the sun for days or weeks. The rover's Spirit and Opportunity relied on solar panels, and both eventually succumbed to dust accumulation that reduced their power output below operational levels. A crewed mission cannot afford that vulnerability. Solar arrays must be large, and they must be kept clean, either through mechanical brushing or electrostatic dust removal. Even with maintenance, solar power is intermittent and weather-dependent. Nuclear power, by contrast, is constant and reliable. A small nuclear reactor, perhaps using a kilo-power design developed by NASA, can generate tens of kilowatts continuously for years. It does not care about dust storms or the angle of the sun. It simply produces heat, which is converted into electricity through thermoelectric materials or Stirling engines. The downside is mass, complexity, and the political and safety challenges of launching nuclear material. But for a long-duration surface mission, nuclear power is likely the only realistic option. Food production on Mars faces the same challenges as in transit, but with additional complications. The Martian environment is more hostile than the interior of a spacecraft. Dust is everywhere, fine and abrasive, capable of infiltrating seals and clogging mechanisms. Radiation levels on the surface are lower than in space, but still significant because Mars has no global magnetic field and its atmosphere is too thin to block cosmic rays. Growing plants in Martian soil is not straightforward. The soil, properly called regolith, is chemically reactive, often alkaline, and contaminated with perchlorates. It lacks the organic matter and microbiological life that makes Earth's soil fertile. Plants could potentially grow in processed regolith, supplemented with nutrients and organic material from waste recycling, but the effort required is substantial. The alternative is hydroponic or aeroponic systems, where plants grow without soil, their roots suspended in nutrient-rich water or mist. These systems are efficient and controllable, but they require infrastructure, energy, and careful management. The crew's waste is a resource, not a burden. Human feces contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients that plants need. Urine contains urea, a nitrogen source. Composting human waste, breaking it down through biological or thermal processes, converts it into a form that can fertilize plants. This is standard practice in sustainable agriculture on Earth, and it will be necessary on Mars. The psychological barrier of eating food grown with recycled human waste is often discussed, but it is not a technical barrier. The food itself is clean. The plants absorb nutrients, synthesize them into sugars, proteins, and fats, and produce fruits or vegetables that are no different from those grown in Earth's soil. The crew must understand and accept this, or they will not thrive. Psychological support on the surface differs from support in transit because the environment is different. The crew is no longer confined to a single module. They can exit the habitat in spacesuits, explore the surroundings, conduct experiments, and experience a sense of place and purpose. Mars is not empty. It is a world with landscapes, geology, weather, and a sky that shifts from pink to blue at sunset. These sensory experiences, though filtered through the visor of a spacesuit, provide stimulation and meaning that combat the monotony of isolation. Work schedules must be structured to allow time for exploration, science, and personal projects. Routine is important, but so is variety. Monotony breeds apathy, and apathy breeds mistakes. Communication with Earth remains delayed, but the crew is no longer in constant motion. They have a fixed position, a sense of home, even if that home is a prefabricated habitat on an alien planet. They can establish routines, personalize their living spaces, and build a microculture within the crew. This is a coping mechanism, and it is essential. Research on Antarctic stations and long-duration spaceflight shows that small rituals, shared meals, celebrations of birthdays or holidays, and collaborative projects strengthen social cohesion and reduce interpersonal conflict. The crew must be given the autonomy to develop these rituals naturally, without rigid imposition from mission planners, because what works for one group may not work for another. After 450 days on the surface, the orbital alignment shifts again. Mars and Earth move into positions that allow an efficient return trajectory. The crew must prepare for departure. This means loading samples, shutting down the habitat, and fueling the ascent vehicle. The ascent vehicle is a rocket smaller than the one that brought them to Mars, but still substantial. It must carry the crew from the surface to orbit, where they rendezvous with the spacecraft that will take them back to Earth. If that spacecraft was left in orbit around Mars, it has been sitting there for over a year, exposed to radiation, temperature swings, and micrometeoroids. Systems must be checked remotely before the crew launches. If the spacecraft has failed, the crew is stranded. This is why some mission architectures propose bringing the return vehicle down to the surface with the crew, refueling it on the ground using ISRU, and launching directly back to Earth from the surface. This eliminates the orbital rendezvous and reduces the number of critical events, but it requires a much larger ascent vehicle and significantly more propellant production on Mars. Assuming the ascent vehicle reaches orbit successfully, the crew boards the Earth return spacecraft, fires the engines, and begins the long transit home. The journey is the same as the outbound leg, 6 to 7 months in microgravity, exposed to radiation, confined to a small habitat. But psychologically, it is different. They're going home. The mission is behind them. Every day brings them closer to Earth. And yet, this is when complacency becomes dangerous. Systems have been operating for over 2 years. Components are worn. The crew is exhausted. Vigilance must be maintained because a failure in the final weeks of the mission is no less fatal than a failure at the beginning. Earth grows from a star to a crescent to a sphere. The blue and white swirl of clouds and oceans is a sight no photograph can fully capture. The crew prepares for re-entry, the final test. Re-entry from interplanetary space is faster and hotter than re-entry from low Earth orbit. The spacecraft hits the atmosphere at roughly 12 kilometers per second, and the heat shield endures temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius. The deceleration is intense, multiple G-forces pressing the crew into their seats after months of weightlessness. Their weakened cardiovascular systems struggle to pump blood against the renewed gravity. Some astronauts experience dizziness or blackout. This is expected. The capsule descends under parachutes, impacts the ocean or land, and the crew is recovered. They are home, but they are not the same. Their bones are brittle. Their muscles are weak. Readaptation to Earth's gravity takes weeks or months. Some effects may be permanent. This is the arc of a crewed Mars mission as it is currently understood. Every phase presents challenges, and every challenge has been studied, modeled, tested, and debated by engineers, scientists, mission planners, and policymakers for decades. The technology to go to Mars exists or is within reach. The question is not whether it is possible, but whether it is practical, whether the risks are acceptable, and whether the resources required, financial, political, and human, can be marshaled and sustained over the years necessary to execute the mission. Because a Mars mission is not a single event. It is a campaign, a sustained effort requiring multiple launches, international collaboration, technological development, and unwavering commitment. Consider the scale of infrastructure required. A single crewed mission to Mars might involve 10 to 15 launches from Earth. Each launch places a component into orbit. Fuel tankers, habitat modules, cargo landers, ascent vehicles, Earth return capsules. These components must dock, refuel, and integrate in orbit before the interplanetary injection burn. Orbital assembly is routine for the International Space Station, but the ISS was built over decades with hundreds of launches. Mars mission hardware must be assembled in months, tested remotely, and certified for a journey from which there is no return for years. The logistics are staggering, and they assume that nothing goes wrong, that every launch succeeds, that every docking is precise, and that every system checks out perfectly. In reality, delays are inevitable. Hardware fails. Launches are scrubbed. Schedules slip. The window to Mars is narrow, and if you miss it, you wait another 26 months. That delay ripples through budgets, personnel, and political will. Funding a Mars mission is not a single appropriation. It is a commitment that spans administrations, elections, and economic cycles. NASA's Apollo program cost roughly $25 billion in 1960s currency, equivalent to over $150 billion today. A crewed Mars mission is estimated to cost anywhere from $100 billion to $500 billion, depending on the architecture and the level of international contribution. No single nation is likely to bear that cost alone, which means partnerships, treaties, and shared decision-making. History shows that international collaboration in space is possible. The ISS is a testament to that. But Mars is a longer commitment, and the geopolitical landscape can shift unpredictably. Sustaining cooperation over the 10 to 15 years required to prepare and execute a Mars mission requires stable institutions, aligned incentives, and mutual trust, all of which are fragile. Private industry is increasingly involved. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others are developing heavy-lift rockets, in-space propulsion, life support systems, and landing technologies. SpaceX's Starship is explicitly designed for Mars missions. With a fully reusable architecture, methane oxygen engines that can be refueled using ISRU on Mars, and a payload capacity measured in hundreds of tons. If Starship succeeds, it could reduce the cost per kilogram to orbit by an order of magnitude, making Mars missions economically feasible in a way they have never been before. But Starship is still in development. Test flights have been partially successful, but the system must be proven reliable, human-rated, and capable of the orbital refueling and long-duration spaceflight required for Mars. That will take years, possibly a decade, and there are no guarantees. Regulatory frameworks for Mars missions are underdeveloped. Who owns the resources extracted from Mars? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies, but it is ambiguous about the use of resources by private entities or individuals. If a crew lands on Mars, drills for water, and produces fuel, do they own that fuel? Can they sell it? Can a company claim mineral rights? These questions have legal, ethical, and practical implications, and they must be resolved before large-scale Mars activities begin because ambiguity breeds conflict. International agreements are slow to negotiate and slower to ratify, but they are necessary for long-term stability. The ethics of sending humans to Mars are also debated. Is it morally acceptable to expose astronauts to risks that, despite all precautions, remain high? The probability of a fatal accident during a Mars mission is not negligible. Estimates vary, but some analyses suggest a 5 to 10% chance of loss of crew. That is far higher than terrestrial aviation, where fatality rates are measured in parts per million. Astronauts are volunteers. They understand the risks. But society must also ask whether the scientific and exploratory gains justify those risks, and whether resources spent on Mars could be better used addressing challenges on Earth. These are not technical questions. They are value judgments, and different people reach different conclusions. Scientific justification for human Mars exploration is often contrasted with robotic exploration. Robots have explored Mars for decades. Orbiters have mapped the surface. Rovers have analyzed rocks, drilled into the soil, and detected organic molecules. Robots are cheaper, do not require life support, and do not risk human lives. They can be sent on one-way missions, operate for years, and transmit data back to Earth. So why send humans? The answer lies in adaptability, dexterity, and real-time decision-making. A human geologist on Mars can examine a rock, recognize an unusual feature, and investigate it immediately. A rover must send images to Earth, wait for instructions, and execute commands hours or days later. A human can climb, dig, operate complex instruments, and respond to unexpected discoveries with creativity and intuition. Robots are improving, but they are not yet at the level of human capability. Whether that gap justifies the cost and risk of crewed missions is a matter of ongoing debate. There is also the question of planetary protection. Mars may harbor microbial life, dormant in subsurface ice or hydrated minerals. If life exists on Mars, it is the most profound scientific discovery imaginable, and it must be studied without contamination from Earth organisms. Conversely, if Mars life exists and is returned to Earth, it must be contained to prevent potential ecological or health consequences, however unlikely. Protocols for planetary protection are strict. Spacecraft sent to Mars are sterilized to reduce the bioload of terrestrial microbes. Samples returned from Mars must be quarantined and studied in biosecure facilities. But humans are walking biomes, carrying trillions of microorganisms internally and on their skin. A crewed mission introduces the possibility of forward contamination on an unprecedented scale. Spacesuits and habitats can be kept as clean as possible, but absolute sterility is impossible. If life on Mars exists, sending humans there risks altering or destroying it before we fully understand it. This is an ethical and scientific concern that cannot be dismissed lightly. Terraforming is sometimes discussed in the context of Mars exploration. The idea is to alter the Martian environment over centuries or millennia to make it more Earth-like, thickening the atmosphere, raising temperatures, introducing liquid water, and eventually enabling plant and animal life to survive on the surface. Proposals involve releasing greenhouse gases to warm the planet, melting the polar ice caps, and importing volatiles from asteroids or comets. Terraforming is speculative and far beyond current capabilities. It also raises profound ethical questions. If Mars harbors native life, even microbial life, terraforming would likely extinguish it. If Mars is lifeless, does humanity have the right to remake an entire planet? And even if it is technically possible, should resources be diverted to transforming Mars when Earth's own environment is under stress? These questions are philosophical and will not be resolved soon, but they loom in the background of any long-term vision for Mars. Short-term goals are more concrete. Establishing a sustained human presence on Mars means building infrastructure, habitats, power systems, life support, communication relays, and surface mobility. It means developing supply chains, even if those chains stretch across interplanetary space. It means training crews, rotating personnel, and maintaining continuity of operations over decades. It means establishing research stations analogous to Antarctic bases, where scientists live and work for months at a time, conducting experiments, collecting data, and expanding our understanding of Mars and the broader questions of planetary science, astrobiology, and human adaptation to extraterrestrial environments. One of the most compelling reasons to go to Mars is not scientific but existential. Humanity evolved on Earth, and for all of recorded history, Earth has been our only home. But Earth is vulnerable. Asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, pandemics, nuclear war, climate change, any number of catastrophes could severely damage or even extinguish human civilization. Spreading to other worlds, becoming a multi-planetary species, reduces that existential risk. Mars is the most accessible candidate. It is harsh, but it is not impossible. If we can establish a self-sustaining colony on Mars, humanity has a backup. This is not a plan for the next decade or even the next century, but it is a vision that motivates much of the current enthusiasm for Mars exploration. It is a vision of resilience and survival, rooted in the recognition that no single world, no matter how precious, should be the sole repository of everything we are. But self-sustaining is a high bar. A colony that depends on regular supply missions from Earth is not self-sustaining. It is a forward operating base, an extension of Earth's infrastructure. True self-sufficiency means producing food, manufacturing equipment, refining materials, and generating energy entirely from local resources. It means building new habitats from Martian materials, using 3D printing or other construction techniques to shape regolith into bricks or centered structures. It means developing medical capabilities to treat injuries and illnesses without relying on evacuation to Earth. It means education, social structures, governance, and culture adapted to the Martian environment. It means, eventually, children born on Mars, human beings who have never experienced Earth's gravity or breathed Earth's air, whose identity and sense of belonging is tied to a red desert world under a butterscotch sky. The idea of Martian-born humans raises biological questions. Human reproduction in reduced gravity is unstudied. We do not know if conception, gestation, and fetal development can proceed normally at 38 centimos. Animal studies have been limited. Some organisms reproduce successfully in microgravity, others do not. Developmental biology is complex, and gravity plays a role in fluid dynamics, cellular differentiation, and skeletal formation. A fetus developing on Mars might face complications that do not occur on Earth. Birth defects, developmental delays, or other health issues could arise. And even if a child is born healthy, growing up in reduced gravity will shape their physiology. Bones and muscles will adapt to Martian gravity, which may make them unable to withstand Earth's gravity if they ever visit. They could be permanently adapted to Mars, unable to return to the world their parents came from. This is speculative, but it is not implausible, and it must be studied before any attempt to establish a permanent, reproducing population on Mars. Legal and ethical frameworks for Martian settlers are non-existent. What laws govern behavior on Mars? Who has jurisdiction? If a crime is committed, who investigates and prosecutes? If disputes arise, who mediates? On Earth, these questions are answered by nation-states, treaties, and international law. On Mars, in the early stages, authority will likely rest with the mission sponsor, NASA, ESA, SpaceX, or whatever entity funds and organizes the mission. But as the population grows and diversifies, governance must evolve. Settlers will demand autonomy, representation, and the ability to make decisions about their own lives. The history of colonization on Earth, with all its injustices and conflicts, offers lessons, most of them cautionary. Mars must not become a site of exploitation or authoritarian control, but ensuring that requires forethought, planning, and a commitment to principles of equity, transparency, and human rights, principles that have often been honored more in rhetoric than in practice. Economic models for Mars settlement are uncertain. What does Mars produce that Earth wants? Transporting physical goods from Mars to Earth is prohibitively expensive given current technology. The only products that might justify the cost are high-value, low-mass items, rare isotopes, scientific data, intellectual property, perhaps even cultural artifacts. Tourism is sometimes proposed. A trip to Mars as the ultimate adventure, the most exclusive destination imaginable. But the cost, even with optimistic projections, would be in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars per person, accessible only to the ultra-wealthy. That market is small, and it does not drive large-scale infrastructure development. More plausible is that Mars, in the long term, becomes economically valuable as a platform for further exploration. Missions to the asteroid belt, the outer solar system, or even interstellar space might be easier to launch from Mars than from Earth, because Mars has lower gravity and no thick atmosphere. Mars could become a hub, a refueling and resupply point, a shipyard. But that is a vision for a future measured in centuries, not decades. In the near term, Mars exploration is driven by governments, science, and the symbolic value of achievement. Landing humans on Mars is a goal comparable to the moon landings, a demonstration of capability, ambition, and vision. It is a project that inspires, that captures the imagination, and that, if successful, will be remembered as one of the defining accomplishments of the 21st century. That symbolic value has political currency. It generates public support, justifies budgets, and motivates international cooperation. But symbols fade. The Apollo program ended not because we lost the capability to go to the moon, but because the political will to continue evaporated. Mars missions face the same risk. Sustained exploration requires sustained commitment, and that commitment is fragile. Technical challenges are solvable given time, money, and effort. But the meta-challenge is coordination. Coordinating the development of dozens of technologies, the training of crews, the execution of launches, the integration of systems, the management of budgets, and the navigation of political and bureaucratic obstacles, all on a timeline that spans decades, is a problem of project management and institutional resilience at a scale that has few precedents. The International Space Station succeeded because it had clear milestones, distributed responsibilities, and a modular design that allowed incremental progress. A Mars program needs similar structures, but with higher stakes and less tolerance for failure. One approach is to break the mission into phases: robotic precursors, cargo pre-deployment, uncrewed test flights, short-duration crewed missions, and finally long-duration surface stays. Each phase reduces risk for the next, building confidence and capability step by step. But each phase also takes years and costs billions, and the temptation to skip steps, to accelerate the timeline for political or competitive reasons, is ever present. China has expressed ambitions for Mars exploration. The China National Space Administration has successfully landed rovers on Mars and has outlined plans for sample return and eventual crewed missions. India's space program has sent an orbiter to Mars. The European Space Agency collaborates with NASA on Mars missions and is developing its own capabilities. The United Arab Emirates has placed a probe in Mars orbit. Mars is becoming a multinational endeavor, not dominated by any single country. This is healthy in some respects. Competition drives innovation, and collaboration spreads costs and risks. But it also introduces complexity. Different nations have different priorities, standards, and risk tolerances. Coordinating international crewed missions is harder than coordinating robotic ones because human safety is involved, and decisions about acceptable risk are deeply cultural and political. If one nation decides to proceed with a high-risk mission, does that pressure others to follow, or does it fracture the coalition? The commercial sector adds another layer. SpaceX has stated that its ultimate goal is to establish a self-sustaining city on Mars. Elon Musk, the company's CEO, has been explicit about this vision, outlining plans for fleets of starships, thousands of launches, and millions of tons of cargo delivered to Mars over the coming decades. This vision is ambitious to the point of sounding fantastical, but SpaceX has a track record of achieving goals that others dismissed as impossible. Falcon 9 reusability, Crew Dragon missions to the ISS, the scale and pace of Starship development, all demonstrate a level of execution that commands respect. Whether SpaceX can actually build a Martian city is uncertain, but the company is pushing the technology forward, and in doing so, it is accelerating the timeline for crewed Mars missions, whether NASA is ready or not. This creates tension. NASA is methodical, risk-averse, and constrained by congressional oversight. SpaceX is aggressive, iterative, and driven by a singular long-term vision. The two entities need each other, but they do not always align, and managing that partnership is a challenge for both. Private missions to Mars also raise the question of who decides what happens on Mars. If SpaceX lands humans on Mars before NASA does, using private funding and private spacecraft, does SpaceX get to set the rules? Does the Outer Space Treaty apply to private actors, or is there a loophole that allows commercial claims? Legal scholars disagree. Some argue that the treaty binds all actors, public and private. Others argue that the treaty is outdated, written in an era when spaceflight was the exclusive domain of governments, and that it needs to be revised to account for commercial activity. The debate is not academic. Real missions are being planned, and the legal ambiguity is real. Resolving it before crewed missions launch would avoid future conflicts, but international law moves slowly, and the space industry is moving fast. Public perception of Mars missions varies widely. Some people see Mars exploration as a waste of resources, a distraction from urgent problems on Earth like poverty, climate change, and inequality. Others see it as essential to humanity's future, a necessary step toward becoming a spacefaring civilization. Surveys show that support for space exploration is generally positive but not overwhelming, and it fluctuates with economic conditions and political climate. During economic downturns, support for expensive, long-term projects like Mars missions tends to wane. During times of optimism and prosperity, it grows. Managing public perception, communicating the benefits and justifications for Mars exploration, and demonstrating tangible progress are all critical to maintaining the political support necessary to fund these missions. Transparency helps. When the public can see what is being done, understand the challenges, and appreciate the achievements, support is stronger. Secrecy and opacity breed suspicion and opposition. Education and outreach are tools for building that support. The images sent back by Mars rovers, the videos of rocket launches, the stories of astronauts training and preparing, all of these engage the public and humanize the mission. Children who grow up watching Mars missions may choose careers in science and engineering, inspired by what they see. That inspiration is not trivial. The Apollo program inspired a generation of engineers, scientists, and explorers who went on to build the Space Shuttle, the ISS, and the robotic missions that have explored the solar system. Mars missions can have the same effect, creating a feedback loop where public interest drives funding, funding drives progress, and progress drives further interest. But this loop can also break. If missions fail, if costs overrun, if the timeline stretches indefinitely without visible results, public interest fades and political support collapses. Avoiding that outcome requires not just technical success, but also effective communication and realistic expectations. Media coverage of Mars missions tends to oscillate between hype and skepticism. Launch events and landing attempts are covered extensively, often with breathless narration and dramatic music. But the years of preparation, the incremental progress, the unglamorous work of engineering and testing receive less attention. This creates a distorted picture where space exploration seems to consist of rare, dramatic moments separated by long stretches of inactivity. In reality, the work is constant and cumulative. Engineers are solving problems every day. Scientists are analyzing data. Astronauts are training. The mission moves forward in small steps, and those steps deserve recognition. Documentary series, long-form journalism, and educational content can provide a more accurate and nuanced portrayal of Mars exploration, helping the public understand the true nature of the endeavor. Mars analog missions on Earth provide valuable insights. Locations like the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, the HIC's habitat in Hawaii, and simulated Mars bases in polar regions allow crews to live and work in conditions that approximate some aspects of Mars. These analogs are not perfect. Earth's gravity is 1 g, not 38 centimos. The atmosphere is breathable. Rescue is possible, but they do simulate isolation, confinement, resource limitations, and a need for autonomous decision-making. Crews in analog missions wear simulated spacesuits during extravehicular activities, conduct scientific research, manage limited supplies, and cope with interpersonal dynamics. The data gathered from these missions informs habitat design, crew selection, operational protocols, and psychological support strategies. Analog missions are also relatively inexpensive compared to actual spaceflight, making them a cost-effective way to test and refine concepts before committing to the real thing. Training for Mars missions is more extensive than training for low Earth orbit missions. Astronauts must be proficient in spacecraft operations, life support maintenance, emergency procedures, extravehicular activity, scientific research, medical response, and even interpersonal conflict resolution. They must be able to diagnose and repair equipment with limited tools and spare parts. They must be comfortable with autonomy, making decisions without waiting for instructions from Earth. They must be physically fit, mentally resilient, and temperamentally suited to long-duration isolation. The selection process will be rigorous, and the training period will last years. Candidates will be tested in simulators, in analog habitats, in underwater environments that simulate microgravity, and in high-stress scenarios designed to reveal how they perform under pressure. Only a small fraction of applicants will be chosen, and even among those chosen, not all will ultimately fly. Backup crews, medical disqualifications, and changes in mission parameters will winnow the roster further. Those who do fly will be among the most capable, most prepared individuals in human history. Backup plans are essential. If the primary spacecraft fails, is there a secondary vehicle? If the habitat on Mars is damaged, is there a backup shelter? If a crew member becomes incapacitated, can the mission continue? Redundancy is expensive, but it is necessary because Mars offers no second chances. Some systems can be redundant within the spacecraft. Duplicate life support processors, extra oxygen tanks, backup power supplies. Other redundancies require entirely separate hardware, a second lander, a reserve ascent vehicle, a spare crew capsule in orbit. The cost of full redundancy is prohibitive, so mission planners must balance risk and budget, deciding which failures are acceptable, which are recoverable, and which are catastrophic. These decisions are uncomfortable because they involve acknowledging that some scenarios, however unlikely, could result in loss of crew, and accepting that as a calculated risk. Radiation shielding remains one of the most difficult challenges. The mass required to effectively shield a spacecraft from cosmic rays and solar particles is enormous. Water, polyethylene, and other hydrogen-rich materials are effective, but you need meters of thickness to provide substantial protection. One proposal is to use a spacecraft's fuel and water supplies as shielding, arranging tanks around the crew quarters. As fuel is consumed during the mission, the shielding decreases, but by that point, the crew is approaching Mars where the surface provides some protection. Another approach is electromagnetic shielding, using powerful magnets to deflect charged particles. This is speculative and technically challenging because the magnetic fields must be strong and large enough to surround the spacecraft, and generating those fields requires significant electrical power. Passive magnetic shielding materials exist, but they are heavy and not sufficiently effective on their own. Active systems, using superconducting magnets, are theoretically possible but have never been tested in space. Research continues, but as of now, there is no lightweight, effective radiation shield for deep space missions. The biological effects of prolonged radiation exposure are not fully understood. Most data comes from atomic bomb survivors, radiation therapy patients, and astronauts on short-duration missions. Extrapolating to multi-year missions involves uncertainty. Cancer risk models are based on statistical correlations, not individual predictions. Some people are more resistant to radiation than others due to genetic factors, and screening for radiation resistance could become part of astronaut selection. But even with screening, the baseline risk is significant. Astronauts on a Mars mission will exceed the lifetime exposure limits currently set for career astronauts by NASA. Those limits are based on a 3% increase in lifetime cancer risk, a threshold chosen as a balance between safety and mission feasibility. Exceeding that threshold does not mean certain death, but it does mean accepting a higher probability of long-term health consequences. This is a trade-off, and it must be made explicitly with informed consent from the astronauts and transparency with the public. Microgravity countermeasures are improving but not perfected. Exercise is the primary tool, but pharmacological interventions are being researched. Bisphosphonates, drugs that slow bone resorption, have been tested on astronauts and show some promise in reducing bone loss. Other drugs targeting muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, and immune suppression are in various stages of development. Nutrition also plays a role. Adequate calcium, vitamin D, and protein intake support bone and muscle health, though exact dietary requirements and microgravity are still being refined. Artificial gravity, if it can be implemented, would eliminate most of these issues, but as mentioned earlier, the engineering challenges are substantial. A rotating spacecraft requires a large radius to avoid disorienting Coriolis forces, and that means a large, massive structure. One concept is a tethered spacecraft, where the crew habitat and a counterweight are connected by a cable and spun around their common center of mass. This reduces the structural mass compared to a rigid rotating structure, but it introduces dynamics and control challenges. The tether must be strong, the rotation rate must be precisely controlled, and docking with a spinning spacecraft is complicated. These problems are solvable, but they add complexity and risk. Psychological support infrastructure must be built into the mission from the beginning. This includes private communication channels with mental health professionals on Earth, access to entertainment and relaxation resources, and protocols for identifying and addressing psychological distress before it escalates. Crew members will be trained to recognize signs of depression, anxiety, and interpersonal conflict in themselves and their colleagues. Peer support is valuable, but it has limits. If multiple crew members are struggling simultaneously, the support network can fail. Having a trained psychologist among the crew is one solution, though that uses a crew slot that could otherwise go to an engineer or scientist. Another approach is telemedicine, with psychologists on Earth providing remote counseling. The communication delay makes real-time conversation impossible, but asynchronous video sessions, written journals, and regular check-ins can still provide meaningful support. The key is to destigmatize mental health issues, making it clear that seeking help is a sign of strength and professionalism, not weakness. The return journey from Mars to Earth is physiologically difficult because the crew has spent over a year in reduced gravity on Mars, 0.38 g, and then returns to 6 months of microgravity during transit. By the time they reach Earth, their bodies are severely deconditioned. Re-entry and landing subject them to several G-forces, a shock to weakened cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems. Recovery after landing is a medical priority. The crew will be unable to walk immediately and may require wheelchairs and physical assistance for days or weeks. Physical therapy will be intensive, gradually rebuilding strength and bone density. Full recovery can take 6 months to a year, and some effects, particularly bone density loss, may never fully reverse. Long-term health monitoring is essential to understand the cumulative effects of deep space missions on human physiology and to inform medical protocols for future missions. Data from the first crewed Mars mission will be invaluable. Detailed biomedical data, collected throughout the mission and during post-flight recovery, will provide insights that cannot be obtained any other way. Tissue samples, bone scans, cardiovascular assessments, cognitive tests, and psychological evaluations will form a comprehensive picture of how humans respond to the Martian environment and long-duration spaceflight. This data will guide improvements in life support, nutrition, exercise protocols, medical care, and crew selection for subsequent missions. In a sense, the first crew are experimental subjects as well as explorers, and they must consent to the extensive medical monitoring and data collection that this entails. Ethical review boards will scrutinize the protocols to ensure that the crew's rights and well-being are protected, that data is used responsibly, and that privacy is maintained where appropriate. Sample return missions, robotic missions that collect Martian soil and rock samples and bring them back to Earth, are planned as precursors to crewed missions. These missions test the technology for launch from Mars, rendezvous in orbit, and Earth reentry, all of which are necessary for a crewed mission. They also provide scientific data about Martian geology, chemistry, and potential biosignatures that inform the choice of landing sites and research objectives for crewed missions. Sample return is technically challenging and expensive, requiring multiple spacecraft, precise coordination, and years of mission time. NASA and ESA have been collaborating on a Mars sample return campaign, with the Perseverance rover collecting samples that will be picked up by a future lander, launched into Mars orbit, and transferred to an Earth return vehicle. This mission is years away from completion, but it represents a critical step toward crewed exploration. The search for life on Mars is a driving scientific motivation. Mars once had liquid water on its surface. Ancient riverbeds, lake beds, and mineral deposits provide evidence of a wetter, warmer past. If life arose on early Mars, as it did on early Earth, remnants or descendants might still exist, preserved in ice or deep underground. Detecting such life would answer one of the most profound questions in science. Is life unique to Earth, or is it a common phenomenon in the universe? The implications are staggering. If life arose independently on two planets in the same solar system, it suggests that life is abundant wherever conditions are suitable. Conversely, if Mars is and always has been lifeless, that raises questions about the rarity and fragility of life. Either answer is scientifically transformative. Human missions enhance the search for life by enabling more sophisticated fieldwork than robots can perform. A geologist on Mars can identify promising formations, drill into rock layers, and analyze samples with instruments that are too complex or too massive to send on a rover. But humans also pose a contamination risk. Even the most stringent sterilization protocols cannot eliminate all terrestrial microbes from a crewed spacecraft or spacesuit. If Mars has native life, introducing Earth life could contaminate the biosphere, making it impossible to determine what is native and what is introduced. This is why planetary protection protocols exist, and why crewed missions to areas with high potential for extant life, such as subsurface aquifers or polar ice, may be restricted until we are confident that contamination can be prevented or detected. Science and exploration must be balanced with responsibility and caution. Mars missions also advance technology in ways that benefit life on Earth. Innovations in life support, recycling, energy generation, material science, and autonomous systems developed for Mars have applications in terrestrial contexts. Closed-loop life support systems can inform sustainable building design and resource management in remote or resource-constrained environments. Advances in solar and nuclear power contribute to the global transition toward clean energy. Autonomous robotics and artificial intelligence developed for space exploration find use in medicine, manufacturing, and disaster response. The argument that space exploration diverts resources from Earthbound problems is countered by the observation that technological progress is not zero-sum. Investment in space often generates innovations that ripple through the broader economy, creating value that exceeds the initial expenditure. Quantifying this value is difficult, but historical analysis of the Apollo program and subsequent space activities suggests that the return on investment, measured in economic growth, technological advancement, and inspirational impact, is substantial. The long-term vision for Mars extends beyond a single mission or even a series of missions. It encompasses the gradual expansion of human presence, the establishment of permanent infrastructure, and eventually the development of a Martian society. This vision is speculative, extending decades or centuries into the future, but it provides a framework for near-term decisions. Infrastructure built for early missions should be designed with scalability in mind. Habitats should be modular, expandable, and adaptable to different uses. Power systems should be upgradable. Communication networks should have capacity for growth. Landing sites should be chosen not just for the science they enable, but for their potential as hubs for future activity. Thinking long-term helps avoid short-sighted decisions that optimize for the immediate mission but create constraints for future ones. Martian time is slightly different from Earth time. A Martian day, called a sol, is about 24 hours and 39 minutes long. This small difference complicates scheduling because human circadian rhythms are tuned to Earth's 24-hour cycle. Living on Martian time means slowly drifting out of sync with Earth time. Mission operations centers supporting Mars rovers often operate on Martian time, with staff gradually shifting their sleep schedules to match the rover's soul-based activity cycle. It is disorienting and exhausting, and after a few weeks, the drift becomes unsustainable. Crews on Mars will live on Martian time because their work is tied to the Martian day-night cycle, which is driven by the rotation of Mars. This may cause subtle circadian disruptions, affecting sleep quality, mood, and cognitive performance. Lighting systems in the habitat can be adjusted to simulate a 24.65-hour day, helping the crew's biological clocks adapt, but the effectiveness of this is uncertain. Long-term studies on Earth and in analog missions are needed to understand the implications and develop mitigation strategies. Dust is a pervasive problem on Mars. Martian dust is fine, electrostatically charged, and abrasive. It clings to everything. It infiltrates seals and bearings. It accumulates on solar panels, reducing power output. It coats spacesuits, contaminating airlocks and interiors. It may be toxic if inhaled, containing perchlorates and fine silicate particles that can damage lung tissue. Managing dust is a constant challenge. Airlocks must have effective dust removal systems, using brushes, air jets, or electrostatic repulsion to clean suits before they enter the habitat. Spacesuits must be designed to minimize dust intrusion, with tight seals and smooth surfaces. Regular maintenance and cleaning are necessary, and filters must be replaced frequently. Dust storms on Mars can be enormous, covering entire hemispheres and lasting for weeks or months. Visibility drops to near zero, sunlight is blocked, and temperatures fall. The crew must shelter in place, relying on stored power and supplies until the storm passes. These storms are not dangerous in the way terrestrial hurricanes are, because the atmospheric pressure is so low that wind speeds, though high in meters per second, exert minimal force. But they're a logistical and operational challenge that must be planned for. Communication infrastructure between Earth and Mars is essential. During the mission, the crew will rely on a network of orbiters, landers, and deep space communication arrays to send and receive data. NASA's Deep Space Network, a collection of large radio antennas in California, Spain, and Australia, tracks spacecraft throughout the solar system. Mars missions will require dedicated bandwidth, high data rates, and reliable coverage. Communication latency, the time it takes for a signal to travel between Mars and Earth, varies from about 3 minutes at closest approach to over 20 minutes at maximum distance. This delay means that all communication is asynchronous. You cannot have a conversation. You send a message, wait, receive a response, wait again. This affects everything from mission planning to personal morale. Crews must be trained to work autonomously, to make decisions without waiting for approval, and to accept that help from Earth, when it arrives, will always be delayed. Navigation and positioning on Mars require infrastructure that does not yet exist. On Earth, GPS satellites provide precise location data. Mars has no equivalent. Crews on the surface will rely on dead reckoning, inertial navigation, and visual landmarks, supplemented by orbital imagery and surface beacons. A Martian GPS-like system could be deployed by placing a constellation of communication and navigation satellites in Mars orbit. This would enable precise positioning, real-time tracking of surface assets, and improved communication coverage. Such a system would benefit not just crewed missions, but also robotic exploration, enabling rovers and drones to navigate more effectively. Building this infrastructure requires investment and international coordination, but it is a logical step in the long-term development of Mars exploration capabilities. Surface mobility is critical. The crew cannot stay within a few hundred meters of the landing site for 450 days. They need to explore, conduct geological surveys, search for water ice, and visit scientifically interesting locations. Pressurized rovers, similar to the lunar roving vehicle used during Apollo, but larger and more capable, allow the crew to travel long distances without the exhausting and time-consuming process of donning spacesuits. A pressurized rover is essentially a small mobile habitat with life support, power, communication, and storage for samples and equipment. It extends the crew's operational range to hundreds of kilometers and enables multi-day excursions. The rover must be reliable, reparable, and capable of traversing diverse terrain. Mars has sand dunes, boulder fields, crater rims, and steep slopes. Autonomous navigation and hazard avoidance systems reduce the workload on the crew and prevent accidents. The rover becomes a critical piece of infrastructure, and its loss due to mechanical failure or accident would severely limit the mission's scientific return. Drones or helicopters provide aerial reconnaissance. The Ingenuity helicopter, a small rotorcraft that flew on Mars as part of the Perseverance mission, demonstrated that powered flight is possible in the thin Martian atmosphere. Future drones could be larger, with longer flight times and greater payload capacity. They could scout ahead for rovers, identifying obstacles and points of interest, or conduct aerial surveys of terrain that is difficult to access on the ground. Aerial imagery with resolutions far better than orbital satellites provides detailed information for planning traverses and selecting sample sites. Drones could also serve as communication relays, extending the range of radio links between the habitat, rovers, and orbiters. The development of Martian drones is in its early stages, but the potential is clear. Subsurface exploration is particularly challenging and particularly valuable. Water ice on Mars is mostly underground, protected from sublimation by a layer of dust and rock. Accessing that ice requires drilling. Drills on Mars must function autonomously, cope with hard, frozen ground, and minimize contamination. They must be lightweight, because every kilogram must be launched from Earth or manufactured on Mars. The drill core samples provide information about Martian geology, climate history, and potentially biology. If microbial life exists on Mars, the subsurface is where it is most likely to be found, sheltered from radiation and desiccation. Drilling to depths of tens or hundreds of meters is a multi-year research program, requiring dedicated equipment and significant power. Early crewed missions may only drill to shallow depths, but future missions, with more advanced infrastructure, could probe deeper. Manufacturing on Mars is a long-term goal. In the near term, almost everything will be brought from Earth. But as missions scale up, it becomes impractical to import every tool, spare part, and structural component. Local manufacturing using Martian materials reduces dependence on Earth and enables growth. 3D printing with Martian regolith is one approach. Regolith can be melted or sintered using solar concentrators or microwave energy, forming bricks, structural panels, and tools. Metal extraction from regolith is more complex but feasible. Martian soil contains iron oxides, and refining those oxides into metallic iron requires heat and chemical processing. Once metallic iron is available, it can be cast, forged, or 3D printed into components. Plastics and polymers can be synthesized from atmospheric CO2 and hydrogen, though the chemical processes are energy-intensive. Developing a closed-loop manufacturing economy on Mars is a challenge that spans chemistry, materials science, and engineering, but it is essential for long-term sustainability. Education and training of Martian settlers, assuming a permanent population eventually develops, is another complex issue. Children born on Mars, if that ever occurs, will need education adapted to their environment and their future. They will need to understand Martian ecology, resource management, engineering, medicine, and the history of their settlement. They will also need connection to Earth's culture and knowledge, but they will develop their own identity, shaped by the unique challenges and opportunities of living on another planet. The curriculum will be a blend of Earth-standard education and Mars-specific training, preparing individuals to contribute to their community while maintaining intellectual and cultural continuity with humanity as a whole. This is speculative, far beyond the scope of initial missions, but it is part of the long arc of human expansion into space. Ethics committees and oversight bodies will play a role in Mars missions. Decisions about risk, resource allocation, planetary protection, and crew welfare must be made transparently and with input from diverse perspectives. Scientists, Ethicists, legal scholars, and representatives of the public should have a voice in shaping mission policy. This is easier said than done because consensus is difficult and decision-making by committee can be slow and contentious. But the alternative, concentrating decision-making power in the hands of a few individuals or a single organization, carries its own risks. Balancing efficiency with accountability is a governance challenge that space agencies and private companies must navigate. Insurance and liability for Mars missions is an emerging issue. If a commercial company sends paying passengers to Mars, who is liable if something goes wrong? Spaceflight is inherently risky, and passengers will sign waivers acknowledging that risk, but legal frameworks vary by country, and international missions complicate jurisdiction. Governments may require insurance coverage for launches, but ensuring a Mars mission, with its multi-year duration and novel risks, is unprecedented. Insurance companies assess risk based on data, and there is no actuarial data for crewed Mars missions. Early missions may be uninsurable in the traditional sense, with governments or sponsors self-insuring by accepting the financial loss if the mission fails. As more missions are flown and data accumulates, the risk profile will become clearer and commercial insurance may become available. But in the beginning, the unknowns are too great. Astronomy from Mars offers unique opportunities. The Martian atmosphere, while thin, still scatters light and introduces some turbulence, but far less than Earth's atmosphere. Telescopes on Mars could observe the universe with less interference than ground-based telescopes on Earth, though not as clearly as space-based telescopes. Mars has no light pollution, no radio interference, and a stable surface to mount instruments. The far side of Mars' moons, Phobos and Deimos, offer even more isolated locations, though building infrastructure there is far in the future. For now, the scientific focus is on Mars itself. But as the human presence expands, observational astronomy from Mars could become a valuable secondary pursuit, contributing to our understanding of the cosmos from a new vantage point. Mars' moons, Phobos and Deimos, are small, irregularly shaped, and thought to be captured asteroids. They orbit close to Mars, Phobos at about 6,000 kilometers altitude and Deimos at about 20,000 kilometers. Phobos is particularly interesting because it orbits Mars faster than the planet rotates, meaning it rises in the west and sets in the east, completing an orbit in just over 7 hours. From Phobos, Mars dominates the sky, a massive red sphere filling the view. Phobos could serve as a staging point for Mars missions, a place to position fuel depots, communication relays, or emergency shelters. Landing on Phobos is easier than landing on Mars because the moon's gravity is almost negligible, only about 1/1000th of Earth's gravity. Spacecraft can dock with Phobos rather than land, using grappling mechanisms or tethers to secure themselves. Exploring Phobos and Deimos is a low-priority goal compared to Mars itself, but they are part of the Martian system and could play a role in long-term infrastructure. Sample curation and analysis on Mars must balance scientific rigor with practical constraints. Laboratory equipment on Earth is sophisticated, sensitive, and bulky. Replicating that capability on Mars is not feasible in the short term. Instead, the crew will perform preliminary analysis, identifying samples of interest and prioritizing them for return to Earth. Portable instruments, miniaturized spectrometers, microscopes, and chemical analyzers provide field data that guide sample selection. The samples themselves must be carefully documented with high-resolution images, GPS coordinates, or the Martian equivalent, and contextual notes about the surrounding geology. Contamination control is critical. Samples must be collected with sterile tools, stored in sealed containers, and kept separate from the crew's living environment. Cross-contamination between samples would compromise scientific value, so strict protocols are necessary. The volume and mass of samples returned to Earth is limited by the capacity of the return vehicle. Optimization is essential. A few kilograms of well-chosen samples can provide more scientific insight than tons of randomly collected material. The crew, working with scientists on Earth, will carefully select which samples to bring back, balancing diversity, scientific potential, and practical constraints. This is collaborative science conducted across interplanetary distances, with decisions made jointly despite the communication delay. It requires trust, clear communication, and shared understanding of the mission's scientific goals. Contamination of Earth by Martian samples is a low probability but high consequence risk. If Martian life exists and is viable on Earth, it could potentially pose a biological hazard. The probability is considered extremely low because Martian life, if it exists, evolved in a completely different environment and is unlikely to be adapted to Earth's conditions. But the consequences, if it did occur, could be severe. Martian samples returned to Earth will be quarantined in a biosecure facility, analyzed under containment protocols similar to those used for dangerous pathogens. Only after thorough study and verification that no viable organisms are present will the samples be released to the broader scientific community. This process takes time, but it is necessary to protect Earth's biosphere. Mars and Earth share a dynamic relationship through the exchange of meteorites. Rocks ejected from Mars by asteroid impacts have traveled through space and landed on Earth. We have collected over 200 Martian meteorites, pieces of Mars that arrived naturally. These meteorites provide information about Martian geology and chemistry without the need for sample return missions. Conversely, Earth rocks have almost certainly been ejected into space, and some have likely reached Mars. This natural exchange raises the question of panspermia, the hypothesis that life could be transferred between planets via meteorites. If microbial life existed on early Earth or early Mars, could it have survived the journey through space and sea to the other planet? The idea is speculative, but scientifically plausible. Microbes can survive extreme conditions, and the interior of a rock provides some protection from radiation. If life on Earth and life on Mars share a common origin, either from a single genesis event on one planet and transfer to the other, or from an external source, that would profoundly change our understanding of biology and the history of the solar system. Géopolitical considération affectent Mars exploration. Space has historically been a domain of international cooperation, but it is also a domain of competition and strategic interest. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space and forbids national appropriation of celestial bodies. It establishes space as the province of all humankind. But enforcement is weak, and as commercial and national interests in space grow, tensions may arise. If multiple nations or entities establish bases on Mars, disputes over territory, resources, or activities could occur. Conflict on Mars is unlikely in the near term because the costs and logistical difficulties are prohibitive, but as capabilities improve and stakes rise, the potential for conflict increases. Strengthening international agreements, establishing clear rules of conduct, and fostering a culture of cooperation are essential to preventing space from becoming a contested frontier. The cultural and psychological impact of Mars exploration extends beyond the individuals directly involved. Mars missions capture the imagination, inspiring art, literature, film, and public discourse. The images of astronauts walking on Mars will be iconic, etched into collective memory like the Apollo moon landings. The first footprint on Martian soil, the first words spoken from the surface, the first human-made structure on another planet. These are milestones that transcend national boundaries and resonate with people across the world. Mars becomes a symbol, not just of technological achievement, but of what humanity can accomplish when it focuses its resources and will on a common goal. That symbolic value should not be underestimated. It can unite, inspire, and drive further exploration in ways that economic or scientific arguments alone cannot. The timeline for the first crewed Mars mission is uncertain. Optimistic projections suggest the 2030s. More conservative estimates push it to the 2040s or beyond. The timeline depends on funding, technological development, political commitment, and the resolution of numerous technical and operational challenges. Delays are almost inevitable. But the direction is clear. Humanity is moving toward Mars. The question is not if, but when and how. The answers to those questions are being shaped right now by the decisions made in engineering labs, boardrooms, political offices, and international forums. Every test flight, every technology demonstration, every dollar allocated brings the mission closer to reality. Preparation for failure is as important as preparation for success. Mars missions will encounter failures. Hardware will malfunction. Systems will degrade. Mistakes will be made. The question is whether those failures are recoverable or catastrophic. Designing for resilience means anticipating failure modes, building in redundancy, and training the crew to respond effectively. Simulations and rehearsals play a critical role. The crew must practice emergency scenarios, fire in the habitat, loss of power, medical emergencies, communication blackouts, life support failures. They must practice until their responses are automatic, because in a real emergency, there may be no time to consult manuals or wait for instructions from Earth. The crew's ability to manage crises autonomously is a survival skill, and it is cultivated through rigorous, repetitive training. Documentation of the mission is essential for learning and improvement. Every decision, every anomaly, every deviation from the plan should be recorded and analyzed. Post-mission reviews, similar to those conducted after spaceflight and aviation incidents, identify what went well and what could be improved. This institutional knowledge, accumulated over missions, forms the foundation for safer, more efficient future missions. It is a process of continuous improvement, driven by data and experience. Organizations that fail to learn from their mistakes repeat them. Organizations that systematically capture and apply lessons become more capable over time. The personal accounts of astronauts, their journals, interviews, and memoirs provide qualitative insights that complement technical data. How did it feel to see Earth shrink to a dot? What was it like to step on a Martian soil? How did the crew cope with isolation, with fear, with the mundane tedium of daily life in a confined space? These narratives humanize the mission, making it relatable and understandable to people who will never experience it themselves. They also provide psychological and sociological data that inform crew selection, training, and support for future missions. The subjective experience of the astronauts is not just a side note. It is a central part of the mission because the success of Mars exploration depends on the people, not just the machines. Mars is not the end goal. It is a step. Beyond Mars lie the asteroid belt, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and eventually the outer reaches of the solar system and beyond. Each destination presents new challenges, new environments, and new opportunities for discovery. Mars teaches us how to live and work on another planet, how to sustain human life far from Earth, and how to build the infrastructure and institutions necessary for a spacefaring civilization. The lessons learned on Mars will apply, with adaptations to other worlds. Mars is a proving ground, a testbed, a first foothold beyond Earth. It is significant not just for itself, but for what it enables. The comparison between Mars and the Moon is inevitable. Both are destinations for human exploration, but they differ in fundamental ways. The Moon is close, a 3-day journey. Mars is distant, a 6-month journey. The Moon has no atmosphere. Mars has a thin one, but it is enough to enable some aerobraking and to provide CO2 for resource utilization. The Moon has water ice in permanently shadowed craters. Mars has water ice widespread, but buried. The Moon has gravity 1/6 that of Earth. Mars has gravity 3/8 that of Earth. These differences affect mission design, physiology, and operational strategy. The Moon is a valuable destination for learning and for infrastructure development, serving as a stepping stone to Mars. But Mars is the greater challenge and the more compelling destination because it is a world with weather, geology, and history, a place that feels, more than the Moon, like a frontier. Public support for Mars missions is cultivated through engagement, education, and transparency. Space agencies and companies must communicate not just their successes, but their challenges, their setbacks, and their plans. When the public understands what is being attempted and why, they are more likely to support the endeavor. Interactive content, virtual reality experiences, live streams of mission events, and educational programs bring Mars exploration into homes and classrooms, making it accessible and engaging. The goal is not just to inform, but to inspire, to invite people to see themselves as part of the effort, even if their contribution is indirect. Public support translates into political support, which translates into funding and policy decisions that enable missions to proceed. The role of artists, writers, and filmmakers in shaping the vision of Mars cannot be ignored. Science fiction has long depicted Mars as a destination for human exploration and settlement. Some of those depictions are fantastical, others are eerily prescient. The Mars of fiction has evolved over time, from the canal-building civilizations imagined by Lowell to the barren, hostile landscapes depicted in contemporary works like The Martian or Red Mars. These narratives influence public perception, creating expectations and shaping the cultural conversation around Mars. They also inspire the scientists and engineers who work on real missions. Many space professionals cite science fiction as a formative influence, a spark that ignited their interest in space. The interplay between fiction and reality is symbiotic. Fiction imagines possibilities, and reality strives to achieve them. And in doing so, it inspires new fiction, perpetuating a cycle of inspiration and achievement. Environmental impact of Mars missions is worth considering. Launch activities on Earth produce emissions, consume resources, and occasionally result in debris or contamination. While the scale of space activity is tiny compared to other industries, it is growing, and the cumulative impact is non-zero. Responsible space exploration means minimizing environmental harm, using sustainable technologies, and considering the full life cycle of missions from construction to launch to disposal. On Mars, the environmental impact is currently negligible because Mars is lifeless, or at least appears to be. But as activity scales up, the cumulative effect of human presence, emissions from power generation, waste disposal, mining, and construction will alter the local environment. Whether this is ethically acceptable depends on the presence or absence of Martian life, and on our values regarding the preservation of pristine environments. These are questions without clear answers, but they must be engaged with honestly. Longevity of hardware in the Martian environment is a practical concern. Mars is harsh. Temperature swings, dust, radiation, and the oxidizing chemistry of the regolith all degrade materials over time. Metals corrode. Plastics become brittle. Seals fail. Regular maintenance and replacement are necessary, but replacement requires spare parts, which must either be stockpiled or manufactured locally. Designing hardware for longevity, using durable materials and modular construction that facilitates repair, reduces the logistical burden. Learning from terrestrial environments like deserts, polar regions, and industrial sites where equipment must endure extreme conditions informs the design of Martian hardware. Failure analysis of robotic missions provides data on how materials and systems degrade on Mars, guiding engineering choices for crew missions. Mars dust devils, small whirlwinds that swirl across the surface, are common. They are visible in images from rovers and orbiters, kicking up columns of dust that can be hundreds of meters tall. Dust devils are less intense than terrestrial tornadoes because the atmospheric pressure is so low, but they still lift and transport dust, contributing to the planet-wide dust haze. For surface operations, dust devils are a minor hazard. They can reduce visibility temporarily and deposit dust on equipment, but they do not pose a direct threat to structures or personnel. Monitoring weather conditions and understanding local atmospheric dynamics helps crews anticipate and respond to dust devils and larger dust storms. Seasonal changes on Mars are significant. Mars has an axial tilt similar to Earth's, about 25 degrees, which means it experiences seasons. The Martian year is nearly twice as long as Earth's, so each season lasts many months. Winter at the poles is severe, with temperatures plunging below -125 degrees Celsius and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere freezing onto the surface as dry ice. Summer sees those ice caps partially sublimate, releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. The polar regions expand and contract seasonally, and this drives atmospheric circulation and weather patterns. Understanding Martian seasons is critical for mission planning because temperature, sunlight, and atmospheric conditions vary dramatically depending on the time of year and the latitude of the landing site. Communication protocols with the crew must account for the delay and the possibility of communication loss. Procedures are established for situations where contact with Earth is interrupted. The crew must be able to operate independently for extended periods, making decisions based on predefined guidelines and their own judgment. Mission rules, similar to those used in aviation and spaceflight, provide a framework for decision-making. Certain actions require Earth's approval. Others can be executed by the crew at their discretion. The balance between autonomy and oversight is carefully calibrated to ensure safety and mission success, while respecting the crew's professionalism and the realities of the communication delay. Language and communication among international crew members is a practical matter. English is currently the lingua franca of spaceflight, used on the International Space Station and in mission control centers worldwide. But future Mars missions may include astronauts from nations where English is not the primary language. Clear communication is essential for safety, and language barriers can lead to misunderstandings and errors. All crew members will be required to be fluent in the mission's working language, likely English, but accommodations for multilingual communication, translation tools, and cultural sensitivity training will also be part of the preparation. As space exploration becomes more international, linguistic and cultural diversity within crews will increase, bringing both challenges and benefits. Diverse teams bring different perspectives and problem-solving approaches, which can enhance performance, but they also require more attention to team cohesion and communication. Religion and spirituality may play a role in crew members' coping mechanisms. Long-duration isolation, confrontation with the vastness of space, and the knowledge that you are the farthest human from Earth can evoke profound existential reflections. Some astronauts find comfort and meaning in religious faith, others in secular philosophy, or simple awe at the universe. Space agencies generally respect individual beliefs and provide opportunities for personal reflection, meditation, or prayer, while maintaining a secular mission environment. The psychological and philosophical dimensions of space exploration are deeply personal and vary widely among individuals. There is no single right way to process the experience, and supporting the crew means respecting and accommodating diverse perspectives. The first words spoken from Mars will be carefully considered. Like Neil Armstrong's, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The initial statement from Mars will be remembered and repeated for generations. The individual who speaks those words carries a responsibility to represent not just themselves or their nation, but all of humanity. The content of that message, whether it is poetic, factual, or inspirational, will set the tone for humanity's relationship with Mars. Mission planners may suggest or approve the phrasing, but ultimately, the moment belongs to the astronaut, and their words should reflect their authentic response to an experience that is unprecedented and transformative. Mars brings into sharp focus the question of what it means to be human. We evolved on Earth, shaped by its gravity, its atmosphere, its ecosystems. We are adapted to this planet in every fiber of our being. Going to Mars means taking ourselves into an environment where we do not belong, where every breath, every drink of water, every step outside requires technology to keep us alive. It is an act of defiance against the natural order, a declaration that humanity is not bound to a single world. But it is also an act of vulnerability, an acknowledgement that we are fragile and that our survival depends on our ingenuity, our cooperation, and our willingness to confront the unknown. Mars exploration is a mirror, reflecting back to us our strengths and our limitations, our ambitions and our fears. The process of going to Mars is, in many ways, more important than the destination. The technologies developed, the knowledge gained, the international partnerships forged, the inspiration generated, all of these have value independent of whether we ultimately establish a permanent presence on Mars. The journey itself transforms us. It pushes the boundaries of what is possible, expands our understanding of the universe, and demonstrates that humanity, for all its flaws, is capable of achieving extraordinary things when it sets its collective will toward a common goal. Mars is a challenge worth pursuing not because it is easy or profitable, but because it is hard, and because in striving to overcome that difficulty, we become more than we were. The engineering challenges of going to Mars are immense, but they are finite and solvable. The biological challenges are significant, but manageable with the right countermeasures. The psychological challenges are subtle, but addressable through careful selection, training, and support. The logistical challenges are daunting, but surmountable with adequate resources and planning. What remains uncertain is the will. Do we, as a species, have the sustained commitment to see this through? Do we have the patience to plan across decades, the resilience to recover from setbacks, and the vision to look beyond immediate concerns and invest in a future that will not be fully realized in our lifetimes? These are not technical questions. They are human questions, and the answers will determine whether the journey to Mars remains a dream or becomes a reality. The spacecraft required for Mars missions are fundamentally different from anything humanity has built before. Low Earth orbit spacecraft, even the ISS, are massive but still tethered to Earth by proximity. A resupply mission can reach the ISS in a matter of hours. A Mars spacecraft must be self-sufficient for years, operating in deep space where help is not coming, where every decision is final, and where the margin for error is non-existent. This demands a level of reliability and robustness that exceeds current standards. Every component must be tested exhaustively, every failure mode anticipated, every redundancy verified. The spacecraft is not just a vehicle. It is a life support system, a habitat, a laboratory, and a lifeline, all rolled into one, and it must function perfectly for the duration of the mission. Heat management on a Mars spacecraft is complex. Electronics generate heat. Human bodies generate heat. Solar radiation adds heat. But space is a vacuum, and in a vacuum, heat cannot be dissipated through convection. It must be radiated away, which is a slow process. Spacecraft have radiators, large panels that emit infrared radiation to shed excess heat. The size and orientation of these radiators must be carefully designed to balance heat generation and dissipation. Too little radiator area, and the spacecraft overheats. Too much, and the added mass is wasteful. Active cooling systems, using fluids pumped through heat exchangers, move heat from internal components to the radiators. These systems must be maintained and monitored because a cooling failure can quickly lead to equipment damage or failure of life support. Power consumption is a zero-sum game on a spacecraft. Every watt used by one system is a watt unavailable to another. Power budgets are tightly managed, prioritizing life support, communication, and navigation over less critical functions. Energy storage, in the form of batteries, provides power during periods when generation is insufficient or when demand spikes. But batteries have limited capacity and degrade over time. Balancing power generation, storage, and consumption requires continuous monitoring and adjustment. Crews must be trained to manage power efficiently, and automated systems help optimize usage, turning off non-essential equipment and redistributing power as needed. Environmental control extends beyond air and temperature. Humidity must be controlled to prevent condensation, which can damage electronics and promote mold growth. Odors must be managed because in a closed environment, unpleasant smells accumulate and can become overwhelming. Air filtration removes particulates, microbes, and trace gases that build up over time. Activated carbon filters absorb volatile organic compounds. HEPA filters capture dust and biological particles. These filters require periodic replacement, which means carrying spares and managing inventory. The spacecraft's environmental control system is a complex, interconnected network of sensors, processors, fans, filters, and chemical reactors, all working in concert to maintain a habitable atmosphere. Microgravity affects not just the human body, but also physical processes. Fluids do not settle. They form floating blobs held together by surface tension. Flames burn differently, forming spheres rather than the teardrop shape seen on Earth. Dust and debris float freely unless captured by air circulation or adhesion. These differences require adaptations in everyday activities. Eating, drinking, washing, using the toilet, all require specialized equipment and techniques. Water must be dispensed in controlled amounts and captured to prevent it from dispersing throughout the cabin. Food is often prepackaged and rehydrated. Waste management systems use airflow to direct waste into collection bags, which are sealed and stored. These systems must function reliably because failures are not just inconvenient, they are health hazards. The spacecraft interior layout is carefully designed to maximize functionality in a small volume. Every surface can serve multiple purposes. Walls have mounting points for equipment and storage. Floors and ceilings, terms that are somewhat arbitrary in microgravity, are used for foot restraints, handholds, and workstations. Privacy is limited. Individual sleeping quarters are small alcoves, just large enough for a sleeping bag and a few personal items. Common areas serve as dining, recreation, and workspaces. The design must balance efficiency with livability, providing enough space for the crew to move and work without feeling claustrophobic while minimizing the overall mass and volume of the spacecraft. Lighting is important for both function and psychology. Bright, full-spectrum lighting helps regulate circadian rhythms, simulating the natural day-night cycle and supporting sleep and wakefulness. Adjustable lighting allows the crew to tailor the environment to their activities, using bright task lighting for work and dimmer, warmer lighting for relaxation. Emergency lighting provides visibility in the event of a power failure. Lighting design is a small detail, but it has a significant impact on crew well-being and performance. Sound control is another factor. Spacecraft are noisy. Fans, pumps, compressors, and other mechanical systems generate a constant background hum. Prolonged exposure to noise can cause hearing damage, increase stress, and interfere with sleep. Acoustic insulation, vibration damping, and careful placement of equipment reduce noise levels. Quiet zones, where noise is minimized, give the crew a place to escape the constant mechanical din. Headphones provide personal audio space for communication, entertainment, or simply silence. Managing the acoustic environment is part of creating a habitat that supports long-term mental and physical health. Waste heat from the crew's bodies and from equipment contributes to the overall thermal load. Humans are warm-blooded and constantly generate heat through metabolism. In microgravity, without convection, this heat does not rise away from the body. It forms a warm layer of air around the skin, which can be uncomfortable and reduce the body's ability to cool itself through perspiration. Active air circulation, using fans, prevents this stagnant layer from forming, keeping the crew comfortable and maintaining thermal balance within the spacecraft. Inventory management is a continuous task. The spacecraft carries hundreds or thousands of items, tools, spare parts, food packets, medical supplies, scientific instruments. Keeping track of what is where, what has been used, and what remains is essential for operational efficiency. Digital inventory systems, barcode scanners, and RFID tags help manage the database. But the crew must also know intuitively where critical items are located because in an emergency, there is no time to search. Organization and discipline in maintaining inventory are part of the crew's training and daily routine. Exercise equipment on the spacecraft must be compact, robust, and effective. Treadmills in microgravity use harnesses to pull the runner down against the treadmill surface, simulating the mechanical load of running on Earth. Resistance machines use elastic bands, hydraulic cylinders, or flywheels to provide force that the crew pushes or pulls against. Stationary bikes generate resistance through magnetic or mechanical braking. Exercise sessions are intense and scheduled daily, often 2 hours or more, because they're the primary countermeasure to the physical deconditioning caused by microgravity. The equipment must be maintained, lubricated, and inspected because mechanical failures can interrupt the exercise program and put the crew's health at risk. Medical capabilities on the spacecraft are limited. The crew includes at least one member with medical training, often a physician or paramedic, but they do not have access to a full hospital. Diagnostic tools are portable and limited: stethoscope, blood pressure monitor, ultrasound, blood analyzer. Treatment options focus on stabilizing injuries and illnesses until the crew returns to Earth. The medicine kit includes antibiotics, pain relievers, anti-nausea medications, and other essentials, but major surgery or intensive care is not possible. If a crew member suffers a life-threatening medical emergency that requires advanced intervention, the options are grim. Medical training for the crew includes how to perform emergency procedures like suturing wounds, managing fractures, and administering fluids, but these are stopgap measures. The best approach is prevention, minimizing the risk of injury and illness through careful planning, safety protocols, and health monitoring. Telemedicine links the spacecraft to medical experts on Earth. The crew can transmit medical data, images, and video for remote diagnosis and consultation. Doctors on Earth provide guidance, recommend treatments, and walk the crew through procedures. The communication delay complicates this. A real-time conversation is impossible, so the exchange is asynchronous, with the crew describing symptoms and waiting for a response. Despite the delay, telemedicine provides a valuable safety net, extending the reach of medical expertise beyond Earth and supporting the crew's health throughout the mission. Dental care is a specific concern. A severe toothache or dental abscess can be incapacitating, and dental emergencies cannot be easily treated in space. Crew members undergo extensive dental examinations and treatment before the mission to minimize the risk of problems during flight. Fillings are secured, wisdom teeth are often extracted, and any potential issues are addressed preemptively. The onboard medical kit includes dental tools and temporary filling materials, and the crew is trained in basic dental first aid. But a serious dental issue is a scenario everyone hopes to avoid. Psychological first aid is as important as physical first aid. Crew members are trained to recognize signs of psychological distress in themselves and others. Withdrawal, irritability, changes in sleep or appetite, decline in performance. Early intervention, through supportive conversation, adjustment of workload, or consultation with mental health professionals on Earth, can prevent a minor issue from escalating into a crisis. The crew functions as a support network, and maintaining strong interpersonal relationships is both a means and an end. A cohesive crew is a resilient crew. Fire is one of the most dangerous emergencies on a spacecraft. In microgravity, flames behave differently, burning in spherical shapes and producing less visible smoke, which makes detection more difficult. A fire consumes oxygen and produces toxic gases, threatening the crew's air supply and health. Fire suppression systems use CO2 or other extinguishing agents to smother flames, and the crew is trained to respond quickly, isolating the affected area, shutting down power, and venting atmosphere if necessary. Fire drills are conducted regularly, and equipment is designed to be flame-resistant. The risk of fire is reduced through careful management of flammable materials, electrical systems, and ignition sources, but it cannot be eliminated entirely. Depressurization is another catastrophic scenario. A micrometeorite or debris impact could puncture the hull, causing a rapid loss of atmosphere. Pressure sensors detect the loss immediately, triggering alarms. The crew must locate the breach and seal it, using patches, foam, or emergency seals. If the breach is large or in a critical location, the affected module may need to be isolated, closing hatches to preserve atmosphere in the rest of the spacecraft. Crew members carry emergency air supplies, small tanks of oxygen that provide a few minutes of breathing time, enough to reach a safe area or to don a spacesuit. Drills prepare the crew for rapid response, because in a depressurization event, seconds matter. Collision avoidance is an ongoing concern. Space is vast, but not empty. Orbital debris, defunct satellites, and micrometeoroids pose collision risks, especially in Earth orbit. Tracking systems monitor known debris, and spacecraft can maneuver to avoid predicted collisions. In deep space, the risk shifts to micrometeoroids, tiny particles traveling at high velocity. Impacts are rare, but not impossible. Shielding, using layers of material to absorb and dissipate the energy of impacts, protects critical systems. The spacecraft's hull is designed with redundant layers, and internal compartments are isolated so that damage to one area does not compromise the entire vehicle. Rendezvous and docking are precision operations. When the crew ascends from Mars and must dock with the Earth return spacecraft in orbit, the two vehicles must match velocities and positions with extreme accuracy. Automated docking systems handle most of the process, using radar, LiDAR, and cameras to guide the vehicles together. The crew monitors and can take manual control if needed. Docking mechanisms, typically androgynous interfaces that fit together regardless of orientation, secure the two vehicles and allow the crew to transfer between them. Once docked, pressure seals are verified and hatches are opened. The transition is brief. The crew moves from one spacecraft to the other, systems are checked, and the vehicles separate. The entire process must be flawless because if docking fails, the crew is stranded. The Earth return spacecraft has been waiting in Mars orbit for over a year. During that time, it has been exposed to the space environment, unpressurized and unoccupied. Systems may have degraded. Before the crew boards, the spacecraft must be powered up and thoroughly checked. Propellant levels are verified. Life support is tested. Navigation systems are calibrated. The spacecraft computer runs diagnostics, identifying any faults or anomalies. Ground controllers on Earth review the data and give approval for the crew to proceed. If a critical system has failed, the mission is in jeopardy. Contingency plans exist, but they are limited. The crew might attempt repairs, cannibalizing parts from the ascent vehicle or improvising solutions. But if the Earth return spacecraft is not functional, the crew cannot come home. Assuming all checks pass, the crew boards, secures the hatches, and prepares for the trans-Earth injection burn. This burn accelerates the spacecraft out of Mars orbit and onto an elliptical trajectory that intersects Earth's orbit. The timing and direction of the burn are calculated with precision to ensure the spacecraft arrives at Earth when Earth is at the correct position in its orbit. This is orbital mechanics at its most exacting. A small error in the burn translates into a large error in the trajectory, potentially causing the spacecraft to miss Earth entirely or arrive at the wrong time. The burn is executed autonomously by the spacecraft's computer, but the crew monitors and can intervene if necessary. Once the burn is complete, the spacecraft is committed. The engines shut down, and the vehicle begins the long coast back to Earth. 6 months in transit. Again, the outbound journey has conditioned the crew for this, but they are older, more tired, and the cumulative effects of radiation and microgravity have taken a toll. The routine resumes, exercise, meals, system maintenance, communication with Earth, scientific observations. The spacecraft passes through the vast emptiness of interplanetary space, a tiny island of life in an ocean of vacuum. Earth grows from a point of light into a visible disk, and then into a planet blue and white and beautiful. The crew watches it grow, counting down the days, the hours, until reentry. Approach to Earth requires another series of precise maneuvers. The spacecraft must aim for a narrow corridor in Earth's atmosphere, an entry window measured in kilometers. Too steep, and the spacecraft experiences excessive deceleration and heat, potentially breaking apart. Too shallow, and the spacecraft skips off the atmosphere, bouncing back into space. The entry corridor is defined by the spacecraft trajectory, and small course corrections are made in the days leading up to arrival. The crew prepares the capsule, stowing loose items, securing seats, and donning spacesuits for the final descent. The service module, which provided power, propulsion, and life support during the journey, is jettisoned just before entry. The crew capsule, a compact, heavily shielded vehicle, is all that remains. It reorients, heat shield forward, and plunges into the atmosphere. The deceleration begins, a gentle push that rapidly intensifies. The heat shield glows red, then orange, then white-hot, as friction with the atmosphere converts kinetic energy into thermal energy. The temperature on the shield's outer surface exceeds 3,000 degrees Celsius, but the interior remains cool, protected by ablative materials that slowly burn away, carrying heat with them. The crew experiences several G-forces, pressed back into their seats as the capsule slows from orbital velocity to subsonic speeds. At high altitude, the heat begins to subside, and the capsule deploys parachutes. First, a small drogue chute stabilizes the descent and slows the capsule further. Then, the main parachutes open, large canopies that arrest the fall and allow the capsule to descend gently toward the surface. The crew sees the horizon tilt and sway as the capsule swings beneath the parachutes. Below, the ocean or land approaches. Impact is softened by retro rockets or airbags, and the capsule settles with a jolt. The crew is home. Recovery teams are already en route, helicopters and ships moving to the landing site. Hatches are opened, fresh air floods in, and the crew is helped out, their legs shaky and weak after months of microgravity. They are lifted onto stretchers, examined by medical personnel, and transported to recovery vehicles. The mission is over. They made it. The months that follow are a blur of medical exams, debriefings, physical therapy, and public appearances. The crew are heroes, celebrated around the world. But they are also patients, subjects of intense medical study. Their bone density is measured, their cardiovascular function assessed, their cognitive performance tested. Blood samples, tissue biopsies, and imaging studies provide data that will inform future missions. The crew's recovery is slow. Bones and muscles must be rebuilt through months of physical therapy. Cardiovascular conditioning returns gradually. Some effects, like slight changes in vision or persistent bone density loss, may be permanent. The crew accepts this. They knew the risks, and they chose to go anyway. The scientific data and samples brought back from Mars are analyzed for years. Martian soil and rock samples are distributed to laboratories around the world, each examining different aspects: mineralogy, chemistry, isotopic composition, potential biosignatures. The data shapes our understanding of Mars' history, its climate evolution, and the possibility of life. Public interest remains high, and the findings are communicated through papers, press conferences, and educational programs. Mars becomes not just a distant planet, but a place we have touched, a world we are beginning to understand. Planning for the next mission begins almost immediately. Lessons learned from the first mission are incorporated into the design of the second. Hardware is improved, procedures refined, landing sites reassessed. The goal is not just to repeat the achievement, but to build upon it, expanding the duration of surface stays, increasing the scope of scientific investigations, and moving toward a permanent human presence. Each mission is a step, and the steps accumulate, each one building on the last, creating a foundation for long-term exploration and eventual settlement. The cost of Mars missions remains high, but as technology matures and operations become routine, costs decline. Reusability, whether of rockets, spacecraft, or surface equipment, reduces the expense per mission. Economies of scale, as production volumes increase, drive down prices. Commercial partnerships and international collaboration spread the financial burden. Over time, the infrastructure in Earth orbit, on the Moon, and at Mars grows, reducing the need to launch everything from Earth's surface for every mission. Fuel depots, repair facilities, and habitats become assets that multiple missions can use, increasing efficiency and reducing redundancy. Public and private sectors both play essential roles. Governments provide funding, regulatory frameworks, and long-term commitment. They fund basic research, support high-risk development, and ensure that missions serve the public interest. Private companies bring innovation, efficiency, and capital, developing technologies faster and at lower cost than traditional government programs. The partnership is symbiotic, with each sector contributing its strengths. Successful Mars exploration requires both, working together toward a common goal. Mars changes our perspective. Seeing Earth from space, as a fragile blue sphere suspended in the blackness, has a profound psychological impact on astronauts, often called the overview effect. Seeing Mars up close, standing on its surface, and looking back at Earth as a distant star extends that perspective even further. It underscores the vastness of space, the uniqueness of Earth, and the insignificance yet preciousness of humanity. It is a humbling, awe-inspiring experience that few will have directly, but that resonates with all of us. Mars exploration is not just about Mars. It is about understanding our place in the universe, about testing our limits, and about reaching beyond the familiar toward the unknown. The story of Mars is still being written. Each mission adds a chapter. Each discovery adds depth. The outcome is not predetermined. Success is not guaranteed, but the effort, the striving, the determination to explore and understand, these are what define us. Mars is a destination, yes, but is also a journey, a challenge, and a reflection of humanity's deepest impulses: curiosity, ambition, and the desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. How we actually go to Mars is a question answered not in a single moment, but across decades of preparation, innovation, risk, and perseverance. It is answered with rockets and computers, with training and planning, with courage and patience, and ultimately, with the recognition that the journey itself, as much as the destination, shapes who we are and who we will become.